Hi, James Perleff here. On August the 31st of 2023, I gave a public PowerPoint presentation in Derry, New Hampshire at the invitation of the regional field director of the John Birch Society. And I think this was perhaps the most important talk I'd ever given. It was a comprehensive history of the New World Order in America from the Panic of 1907, which essentially ended up creating the Federal Reserve, right through Council of Foreign Relations, the various wars, media control, right up to today's COVID and climate change mandates. And when I say comprehensive, I should stress, of course, that dealing with so many topics, I had to be concise. And of course, many details were left out. But this was designed to be an introductory talk for someone who was unfamiliar with the fact that America is largely under the control of an oligarchy, which does not have our best interest at heart. The talk went really well, lasted about 2 hours with a break in the middle. But then something strange and unfortunate happened. Turned out one of the videographers, we had two videographers, and one of them, his camera malfunctioned during the first half, and he was only able to tape the second half. The other videographer has simply, for all practical purposes, vanished. Now, this was a young person, a young man, very red-pilled, someone who I was on very friendly terms with. But for the past month, he's not been answering texts or emails or phone calls from me or from anyone else. We just don't know what happened to him. We hope that he's all right. In the meantime, we don't have his videotape. So faced with this dilemma, I finally decided that the best thing to do would be to re-record the first half of my presentation on my PC. And then a tech-savvy friend of mine will insert my PowerPoint slides into actually the entire presentation. So during the first half, you won't see me moving around or hear audience reaction, but you will see the slides and you will hear my voice. And by the way, when I gave the original presentation, I used what PowerPoint calls a presenter view with notes. So you'll be hearing really the same words that I was using in the original talk. There might be some difference in sound quality because two different microphones are involved. In the meantime, if my missing friend does turn up and we can get hold of his videotape, we will reconstruct this video as it was originally intended to be shown. In the meantime, I thank you very much for your understanding. Tonight's presentation is entitled An Oligarchy Controls America, Fact or Conspiracy Theory. I'd like to start out by making some observations and then asking a question of logic. Some of you might remember that Obama ordered that all school bathrooms be open to transgenders. This was an illegal order, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Very clear that the federal government has no authority that's not granted to it by the Constitution. Otherwise, it's a matter for the states themselves to decide. Nothing in the Constitution gives the president the authority to control people's bathroom choices. Now, I'm going to play some video clips. I'll abbreviate them. I'm sure a lot of you know the Bud Light commercial.
Hi, impressive carrying skills, right? I got some Bud Lights for us. So, I kept hearing about this thing called March Madness, and I thought we were all just having a hectic month, but it turns out it has something to do with sports. And I'm not sure exactly which sport, but either way, it's a cause to celebrate. This month, I celebrated my day 365 of womanhood, and Bud Light sent me possibly the best gift ever, a can with my face on it. Check out my Instagram story to see how you can enjoy March Madness with Bud Light and maybe win some money too. Love ya! Cheers! Go team!
All right, here's Lego.
This is the A to Z of awesome. A Lego celebration of the beautiful, powerful language of the LGBTQIA+ community.
Lego Play offers a universal, but most importantly, a safe space to express yourself and be who you are.
I'm a Black, queer woman who loves Lego bricks.
We invited members of the community to build Lego creations that represent their true stories.
Okay, so it goes on like that. And next is North Face, the manufacturer of outdoor winter wear.
Hi, it's me, Patagonia, a real-life homosexual. And today I'm here with the North Face. We are here to invite you to come out in nature with us. Wow, this is nice.
Okay, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what's been going on with Target.
That's right. Read the shirt. Today we're here at Target. Let's go in and see what they got going on for Pride Month. So right now I'm standing.
Make America straight again.
This is great. They're definitely not pushing this to your kids.
The gayest place on earth.
And my personal favorite, really want to make your presence known? It's not a phase, Dad. We also got coloring books. Hold on, let's... You know, it's normal, right?
Now, without even passing judgment on anyone, we can ask a logical question. I don't know what percentage of people are trans, but let's just say, for the sake of a discussion, that it's 1%. Now, if America has a representative government, why would our government order something that only represents 1% of the voters while ignoring the 99% who are not asking for trans bathrooms? And why would corporations do something that only represents 1% of the customer base and offends most of the other 99%? Is it because drag queens met with the CEOs of corporations and persuaded them of the justice of their cause? Presidents and corporate heads don't take their orders from little people below. They take them from above. So who's up above? This is Ferdinand Lundberg, who was one of America's most eminent finance journalists. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal, New York Herald Tribune, many more mainstream publications. And here's what he wrote in his 1937 book, America's 60 Families, slightly condensed. Quote, the United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern industrial oligarchy, which dominates the United States, functioning discreetly under a democratic form of government, behind which a de facto actual government, absolutist and plutocratic, has gradually taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, informal, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy, end quote. And I have the book right here. Now, what he's referring to is what we now call the deep state. Lundberg showed that the 60 controlled most of the major corporations. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. He documented it from the financial records. They didn't own a corporation outright. They at least owned enough stock to have what we call a controlling interest. In that book, he also had a chapter called Press of the Plutocracy, and he went from coast to coast and demonstrated that the 60 owned most of the newspapers and newspaper chains. Again, not a conspiracy theory. He showed from the financial records exactly who owned what publication. A theory is something that's hypothetical. When something is proven to be a fact, it's not a conspiracy theory. Now, today it's worse. 5 corporations control over 90% of the mainstream media. This graphic shows you 6, but CBS merged with Viacom, so now it's 5. GE, News Corp, Disney, Time Warner, CBS/Viacom. ABC was once an independent TV network, but today it's owned by Disney. National Geographic, once an independent journal, is now owned by Disney. ESPN is Disney. The Wall Street Journal, once an independent newspaper, is now owned by News Corp, as is the London Times. All of the Hollywood movie studios, once independent, are now owned by these big 5. And if you were to extend these lists, each one would include hundreds of media outlets. Let me show you something. Notice that these newscasters come from different networks: CBS, NBC, Fox.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Now, that's what I call independent journalism. Lundberg also documented that the oligarchs were selecting presidential candidates before the nominating conventions even took place, whether it was a Democrat like Woodrow Wilson or a Republican like Herbert Hoover. Let's get away from Lundberg. Take 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president. Now, question, according to a Gallup poll taken just 7 months before Carter was nominated at the Democratic National Convention, what percent of Democratic voters favored him for president? Answer, less than 4%. Carter was governor of Georgia. Few people outside the state even knew who he was. So what happened? Well, it began with a dinner with David Rockefeller, kingmaker of the establishment at that time, at his Tarrytown, New York estate. Also present was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who helped Rockefeller found the Internationalist Trilateral Commission, which Carter joined, and Carter would later appoint Brzezinski as his national security advisor. Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater said of this meeting, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers, end quote. Now, the media blitz included puff pieces of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal editorial declaring that Carter was the best Democratic candidate. And before the nominating convention, his picture appeared on the cover of Time 3 times and Newsweek twice. Times cover artists were even instructed to make him look as much as possible like John F. Kennedy. And the major TV networks began inundating the public with interviews of Carter. Not surprisingly, Carter got the nomination at the Democratic Convention. But did he win it because all across America, sovereign voters spontaneously decided that he was the best candidate? Or was it because he was picked on a high place and then packaged and sold through the media? But it isn't just about electing presidents. It's about controlling sitting presidents by supplying their cabinet members. On the back cover of my 2013 book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, I wrote this. Since its 1921 founding, what small organization has produced 21 secretaries of defense, 19 treasury secretaries, 18 secretaries of state, and 16 CIA directors? Those numbers have gone up since then, of course. Well, the answer to that is it's the Council on Foreign Relations. The council was the subject of my 1988 book, The Shadows of Power, which has sold well over 100,000 copies. I don't know what the total is now, but in that book, I went through administration after administration, Roosevelt through Reagan, showing how each administration drew its cabinets chiefly from the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short. President Kennedy said, quote, I'd like to have some new faces here, but all I get is the same old names, end quote. He was talking about the council. Do you ever notice how often bankers and corporate heads become cabinet members, even if they have no relevant experience? Let me quote the New York Times, 1985. Quote, John C. Whitehead has been named the next Deputy Secretary of State. It was announced today. Mr. Whitehead retired last November as co-chairman of Goldman Sachs. Mr. Whitehead brings to the job no apparent expertise in international diplomacy. In describing his attributes for the job, Mr. Schultz, the Secretary of State, said that Mr. Whitehead was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was regularly invited to dinners given by Henry A. Kissinger, the former Secretary of State. Now, today it's worldwide. Klaus Schwab is a protege of Henry Kissinger. He runs the World Economic Forum, which meets in Davos, Switzerland. Here's their famous motto: welcome to 2030. I own nothing, I have no privacy, and life has never been better. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This is how our world could change by 2030. Now, somebody's going to own the property. If it's not the people, the government, right? Now, was there ever a form of government where the state owned everything and the people owned nothing? What do we call that? That's right, it was called communism. Quoting Karl Marx, quote, the theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property. Now, the World Economic Forum controls presidents and prime ministers throughout the Western world and supplies much of their cabinets. Here's a clip of Klaus Schwab describing this.
When I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
So the World Economic Forum does the same thing as the Council on Foreign Relations, supplying cabinet members, only it does so on a global level. Now, you saw Schwab speak of the Young Global Leaders Forum. This is a program that boasts many famous graduates, including Sunak, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain, Emmanuel Macron of France, Angela Merkel of Germany, Trudeau, he mentioned Canada, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, and many influential people outside of politics, including Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Chelsea Clinton, Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, the largest investment firm in America. Now, Schwab has been credited with coining the phrase "build back better." So let's watch this clip now.
Question to ask, how do we build back better?
To build back better or whatever.
We have a chance to reset the clock and build back better than before.
To build back better than before.
Remember the terrible damage of COVID as we try to build back from this global pandemic.
Joe Biden calls it build back better.
Build back better.
Building back better.
To do things differently. To build back better.
We're going to build it back better.
And build it back better.
To my plan to build back better.
Start taking all the problems that have been created in education and mental health and start to build back in a positive way.
I have launched a booklet called Build Back Better, written after coronavirus.
It's about building this country back better.
Growing conspiracy following it. It is called the Great Reset.
Unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live.
The great opportunity for reset.
The theory even calls Mr. Biden's campaign slogan, Build Back Better, a front for the conspiracy.
Build back better.
Building back better our economy.
Build back better.
That last individual, of course, was Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. Now, you saw the clip of the newscasters all saying the same thing. Now you see politicians doing the same thing. Because the deep state oligarchs control both politicians and the media, they can now create whatever narrative they want as a new normal. That means whether you're talking about COVID or climate change or the war in Ukraine, gun control, immigration, cashless society, transgenderism, white privilege, they're all going to tell you the exact same story and they all express the same opinion. This doesn't mean there aren't a few exceptions in politics. You know, we do have a few good congressmen and governors that oppose these agendas, and occasionally you'll hear a dissenting voice on Fox News because the deep state wants to give you the feeling that you have a choice. You saw what happened to Tucker Carlson when he gave you too much of a choice. Now let's walk to the history of this international oligarchy. Some of you may wonder, well, why investigate history? We care about what's happening today. Well, as has been famously stated, if we don't know history, we're doomed to repeat it. Secondly, looking at history establishes the patterns, the MO, the method of operation of the oligarchs. First, we should know some of the goals of the oligarchs. They have long sought a world government. They are enemies of freedom. They want a totalitarian form of government ruling people, essentially communism. They're hostile to Christianity and to traditional values. They want a reduced world population, which is easier to control. And they're seeking personal profit, but that is not their foremost objective. Money is necessary to consolidate their power. Money makes the world go round, as they say, and it can buy your politicians and people in the media. That's not, of course, a complete list of their goals, but it'll do for right now. We're going to start with the Panic of 1907, and some of you might wonder, well, why is that relevant? Well, not only did it profit two of the most powerful monopolists of the day, John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, but it also created something whose effects we're still feeling today. I'm going to give you a highly condensed version. You can find the full details with documentation on my website, jamesperloff.net. Now, the Rockefellers wanted a monopoly on copper. They owned Amalgamated Copper, which was rapidly buying up all its competitors. But one man stood in their way, Augustus Hines. Now, Hines was a mining engineer, and he developed a new method of extracting copper. And he formed his own company, United Copper, which was underselling the Rockefellers. He gave his miners great benefits and was loved by his employees, unlike the Rockefellers, who sent thugs to massacre the striking miners, including their wives and children. Look up the Ludlow massacre sometime. So the Rockefellers vowed to take Hines down. And that's according to the founder of Barron's magazine. Now, I'm going to have to simplify things due to time, but essentially what happened was the Rockefellers began short selling the stock of United Copper. Short selling, of course, is when you sell shares of a stock that you don't own yet with a pledge to buy it later. Investors will typically short sell a stock if they think its value is going to go down. So you might short sell a stock, selling it, say, at $10 a share, and if the stock goes down later on, you can buy it back at $1, and so you've made a huge profit for yourself. Now, Hines discovered that the Rockefellers were massively short selling his company's stock, driving the price down in an attempt to panic his investors. So Hines and his brothers, who ran a brokerage house, spent all their money attempting to counterattack by buying up shares of their own company, driving the price back up, hoping to force the Rockefellers to cover their shorts, as they say, buying the stock back at a high price. But he couldn't match the power of the House of Rockefeller. The stock became worthless. Hines and his brothers lost all their money. Hines died in poverty at the age of 44. His company was ruined, and the Rockefellers gained the monopoly on copper that they had long coveted. Now, a number of banks have been holding large amounts of United Copper stock, and Hines had been on the board of several banks. Spurred on by newspapers, runs now began on those banks. Now, most of you know what a run is. Banks loan out money they have on deposit, especially through mortgages, and this is often their main means of profit. However, if a bank loaned out too much money, many depositors panicked and simultaneously rushed to the bank and demanded their money. The bank could collapse. And a run, of course, is depicted in the famous movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Now, these runs on banks associated with Hines actually were the beginning of the Panic of 1907. And this is where J.P. Morgan steps in. Just as the Rockefellers wanted a monopoly on copper, J.P. Morgan, who controlled U.S. Steel, wanted a monopoly on iron ore, which, of course, is used to make steel. And particularly wanted to take over the Tennessee Coal and Iron Corporation, which held deposits of 700 million tons of iron ore. Morgan extended and expanded the Panic of 1907 by planting fake news in newspapers, many of which he controlled. For example, Morgan Partners planted a story in the New York Sun and the New York Times, both of which had been started with Morgan money. The story they planted was that a rival bank, the Trust Company of America, was in big financial trouble and that there had been a major run on the bank. The story was completely false. The Trust Company of America was an absolutely solvent bank. It had $74 million in assets and $12 million in cash, and there had been no run in the bank whatsoever. But guess what happened? The bank's depositors, seeing the fake news story, really did panic, and there really was a run on the bank, which exhausted the $12 million in cash it had on hand, bringing it to the brink of ruin. So now JP Morgan goes to Oakley Thorne, president of Trust Company of America, and tells him, listen, Oakley, I'll bail you out on one condition. Your bank owns a huge number of shares of Tennessee Coal and the Iron Corporation. Give them to me, and I'll bail you out. Thorne conceded, and the same fate befell other banks. Thus, J.P. Morgan gained a monopoly in both iron and steel. Now, controlling both iron and steel was a violation of America's antitrust laws, so Morgan and his partners paid a personal visit to the White House and persuaded President Teddy Roosevelt to look the other way while they did their dirty work. Now, if you go to the Federal Reserve websites, they claim that J.P. Morgan was the great hero of the panic of 1907. They say that he personally used his own money to save the banks. They give the impression that Morgan was somehow sacrificially gifting his money to these banks. But here's what they don't tell you. Not only did he demand their iron stock, but as the panic spread, he loaned money to other failing banks at interest. And do you know what the interest rate was? 25 to 60%. If the banks failed to pay, Morgan took them over. What a guy. Details of this were brought out by congressional investigations later on, the Stanley Committee and the Pujo Committee. But no bankers went to jail. Big surprise, right? But Rockefeller and Morgan had an even bigger long-range goal. And that was the creation of the Federal Reserve. After they started this panic, the newspapers began screaming for bank reform. And in 1908, Congress formed the National Monetary Commission to recommend quote-unquote reforms. The commission was chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was so close to John D. Rockefeller that his daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his son William became president of the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank. He was also the maternal grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, who became vice president under Gerald Ford. His full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and he was also the grandfather to David Rockefeller, who was chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations for 17 years, and was still honorary chairman when he died in 2017 at the age of 101. The commission led to the Federal Reserve, which was created by private banking interests in a secret meeting on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. And this is not a conspiracy theory. Jekyll Island was a private island back then, but today you can go to the Jekyll Island Club Hotel and you can sit and wait. They themselves call the Federal Reserve Room where the Fed was planned. Here's a screenshot from their website. I'm going to quote Frank Vanderlip, who attended that meeting. He was president of National City Bank. By the way, you know how he got that position? Vanderlip had been the assistant secretary of U.S. Treasury in 1898, and he oversaw the sale of $200 million in government bonds, which financed the Spanish-American War of 1898. That war put Cuba's sugar industry, the richest in the world, directly into the hands of the Rockefeller's National City Bank. Here's one of their ads. National City Bank boasting of its new Cuban sugar. Now, the Rockefellers used the U.S. military to steal the sugar industry from Spain. There's only one of about 7 reasons that motivated that war. It's the first chapter of my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. So you see, kiss up to the oligarchs, they'll make you a bank president. That's the way the world still works. In a memoir published in 1935, Vanderlip said this. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel there's any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. If it would be discovered that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress, end quote. So who's at the meeting? Representing the Rockefeller interests were Vanderlip and Aldrich. Representing the J.P. Morgan interests were Benjamin Strong, head of JP Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner of JP Morgan and Company, and Charles Norton, vice president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. But the main man, the major figure who actually ran the meeting was Paul Warburg, representing the European Rothschild interest. He was a partner in Kuhn Loeb, the Rothschild banking satellite in New York City. The result was the Federal Reserve. Senator Aldrich introduced the original legislation, but it was voted down due to his close ties to the Rockefellers. But a very similar bill, the Glass-Owen Act, was passed in 1913. Why do they want a central bank? Why do they want the Fed? Well, who does President Woodrow Wilson appoint as the first vice chairman of the Fed? Paul Warburg, the very man who ran the meeting at Jekyll Island. And who becomes the head of the New York Fed, the system's nucleus? Benjamin Strong, who was also at Jekyll Island. The very people who secretly designed the Fed now ran it. As they say, the foxes were guarding the henhouse. But why do they want to run the Fed? Well, the Fed sets interest rates, and that in turn controls the direction of the stock market. They would always know whether to be in or out of stocks. Also, to satisfy the needs of the U.S. Treasury when it's out of money, which is like always, the Fed was empowered to create money from nothing in exchange for Treasury bonds. This meant the U.S. government could now spend without limit on wars, corporate bailouts, and so forth. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this through Jed Griffin's wonderful book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which explains it in detail. Now, what was the effect of this on the U.S. dollar? Inflation. Every time you increase the amount of dollars, the value of the dollar drops and prices rise. Check out this graph. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a chart of inflation from Oregon State University. It starts in 1774. Notice that there were blips of inflation, like during wars, like the War of 1812, the Civil War, when the government would print money to pay for the war. But after the wars, inflation receded, and the dollar's long-term value remained stable for 140 years. But look at the graph's right side. After the Fed is created in 1913, inflation strikes, takes a little dip for the Great Depression when people couldn't afford to buy things, but after that skyrockets. Also notice that this graph ends in 2012. As you know, it would spike much higher if it went through 2023. Now, the Fed always says it's trying to fight inflation. This is a joke. The Fed is the cause of inflation. In the meantime, Americans would have to pay interest on all those treasury bonds that the Fed received in exchange for its fiat money, money created from nothing. The Fed would then sell these bonds in the open markets, domestic and foreign, sending out a national debt through the roof. In many cases, the oligarchs themselves bought the bonds. They especially love those 30-year bonds, which pay incredibly high interest rates, but the profits are all tax-free. But how was the government going to pay off the debt on these bonds? The answer was income tax. You know, there was no income tax before 1913. The Supreme Court had declared it was unconstitutional in 1895. So it had to be legalized by constitutional amendment. Guess which senator introduced that amendment? Nelson Aldrich. Income tax was initially just 1% of incomes up to $20,000, which would be over $500,000 in today's dollars. That's why the American people accepted it. They were told it would never go up. This is a strategy of boiling the frog. It said that if you want to boil a frog, you can't just toss them in boiling water. Instead, you put them in lukewarm water and gradually turn up the heat. That way, the frog never realizes he's been boiled. The frog in this case was the American taxpayer. And don't think that the oligarchs were worried about income tax themselves. In 1933, the U.S. Congress held the Pecora hearings, which investigated whether or not Wall Street bankers had triggered the stock market crash of 1929, which they had. One of the interesting things that came out of those hearings was that none of the partners of JP Morgan and Company had paid a penny of income tax in 1932. And none of them had paid a penny of income tax in 1931 either. Now, in the summer of 1970, I worked for minimum wage at $1.80 an hour. But I paid more income tax that year than the billionaire Nelson Rockefeller. He didn't pay 1 cent. Now, I'm not saying this was illegal. The rich simply have ways of getting around income tax. And I'm not saying that they never pay it, of course. But in 1913, the oligarchs had created a way to create money and a way to pay the debt on it. Now all they needed was something to spend on. 6 months after the Fed was enacted, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his wife were assassinated, touching off World War I. We joined the war. Our national debt increased from a rather manageable 1 billion to 25 billion. Now it's officially 32 trillion, but people say it's actually much more than that due to black budgets, off the book spending, and bad accounting procedures. How did the United States get into World War I, by the way? In 1915, England and her allies were at war with Germany and her allies, but America was not yet in the war. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship that was torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1915 off the south coast of Ireland. 1,200 passengers died, including 128 Americans. And Woodrow Wilson pushed the Lusitania incident for all it was worth to bring us into the war. You can read about it in my extensive online post, False Flag at Sea, which is also a chapter in my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. I give you a highly condensed version tonight. Here's what the public didn't know. The Lusitania was transporting war munitions to England for its use in the war against Germany. This was illegal to mix civilian passengers with war material. So what was on board the Lusitania? 173 tons of Remington rifle cartridges, 80 tons of gun cotton, which was an explosive the British used in their sea mines, 50 tons of shrapnel shells, 46 tons of aluminum hydroxide, another powerful military explosive, and 18 cases of percussion fuses, which consisted of mercury fulminate, another very powerful explosive. Now, these explosives were why the Lusitania, a 32,000-ton ship, went down in just 18 minutes after a single torpedo hit. All survivors said there were two explosions, a small one, which was a torpedo hitting, followed by a massive one, which was a munitions detonating. And the Lusitania repeatedly carried munitions to England, using passengers as a shield. This wasn't the first time. But the Germans could no longer allow weapons to reach England, which would use them to kill German soldiers. Now, here's what Senator Bob La Follette, who was like the Ron Paul of his day, said in 1917. Quote, 4 days before the Lusitania sailed, President Wilson was warned in person by Secretary of State Bryan that the Lusitania had 6 million rounds of ammunition on board besides explosives. And the passengers who proposed to sail on that vessel were sailing in violation of a statute of this country that no passengers shall travel upon a railroad train or sail upon a vessel that carries dangerous explosives. And the oligarchy then moved to have La Follette impeached from Congress for saying this. And official impeachment proceedings were underway, but stopped when William Jennings Bryan, who had resigned as Wilson's Secretary of State over Wilson's push for the war, came forward and corroborated what La Follette said. Also, under the auspices of Winston Churchill, who was then head of the British Admiralty, the Lusitania was sent directly into an area where a U-boat had sent 2 ships the previous day. Now, normally destroyers would accompany the Lusitania when it entered British waters, but on May the 7th, 1915, no escort of the destroyers were sent out, even though 4 destroyers were lying idle in the nearby port of Milford Haven. Patrick Beasley was probably the leading authority in the history of British naval intelligence. He was long an officer in British naval intelligence. Here's what he wrote in his book, Room 40. Quote, nothing, absolutely nothing was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I'm reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy, that's his term, conspiracy, deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even a board of attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval. End quote, Patrick Beasley. What the goals of the oligarchs in World War I? Well, like all wars, was multifaceted. For one thing, it involved war profiteering. Now, the post-war Graham Committee of Congress published a 21-volume report detailing how corporations stole $6 billion from American taxpayers for war materials that were never manufactured or sent to the front. They just folded the money right back to their own companies. In the meantime, U.S. soldiers risked their lives for a salary of $1 a day on the front. Now, the man who oversaw this plunder was Wilson's backer, Bernard Baruch, who Wilson made head of the War Industries Board. The Graham Committee handed down many indictments, but they were all quashed. Not one banker went to jail. No surprise there. At the close of the war, Woodrow Wilson, who's on the right, went to the Paris Peace Conference, which is settling the aftermath of the World War. Wilson didn't bring a single member of his Democratic Party with him. No senators, not one congressman, just bankers. Who does Wilson appoint to head the U.S. delegation to the Paris Peace Conference? Paul Warburg, same man he appointed to head the Federal Reserve. Who is Wilson's chief economic advisor at the conference? Bernard Baruch. And always at Wilson's side was the unofficial advisor who lived right in the White House, serving as Wilson's handler for the oligarchs, Edward Mandell House. Remember what we said earlier about how the oligarchs wanted world government? What was the main proposal Wilson introduced at Paris? The League of Nations. This is the first attempt at world government. It wasn't an all-powerful world government, but you got to start small and gradually boil that frog. The League was not Wilson's idea. Ray Stannard Baker, who was Wilson's official biographer, said this, quote, practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenant of the League was original with the president. It was written by Edward Mandell House, funding for the oligarchs. House's biographer, Charles Seymour of Skull and Bones, said this, quote, Wilson approved the House draft almost in its entirety with his own rewriting of it, practically confined to phraseology. The League of Nations was created, but America didn't join. Fortunately, the U.S. Constitution states that no president can unilaterally make a treaty. The U.S. Senate had to ratify it. They rejected the Versailles Treaty, which formed the League. They didn't want an international body infringing on our sovereignty. Now, when the news of the Senate vote reached Paris, the bankers reacted swiftly. They held a series of meetings, culminating with a dinner at the Majestic Hotel, at which they resolved to form a new organization in the United States. Its purpose would be to change the climate of American opinion so that our nation would accept world government. In 1923, 1921, that organization was incorporated in New York City as the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short. Examination of the Council's original roster reveals that most members were bankers or lawyers affiliated with J.P. Morgan & Company. For example, J.P. Morgan's personal attorney, John W. Davis, was the CFR's founding president. Morgan attorney Paul Cravath was the founding vice president. Morgan partner Russell Leffingwell was the first chairman. Take a look at the leadership of the council today. They're still bankers. And of course, as we mentioned, David Rockefeller was chairman for 17 years. Foreign Affairs is a journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. Its very first issue, 1922, carried an article called The Next American Contribution to Civilization. And what was that to be? Join the League of Nations. In the second issue of 1922, Foreign Affairs declared, quote, obviously there's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind as long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government, end quote. And they've pushed for world government, that narrative, to this very day. Another objective of World War I to establish the world's first communist state. The Bolsheviks exploited the chaos of the war to stage the revolution. The cooperation between the capitalists and the Bolsheviks was astounding. Remember what we said before, how the bankers at the World Economic Forum are advocating a world where no one owns anything except themselves, of course. Jacob Schiff, senior partner in Kuhn Loeb, gave $20 million in gold to Leon Trotsky for the cause of the revolution. Schiff was the father-in-law of Paul Warburg, head of the Federal Reserve. Wilson postponed the U.S. declaration of war until after the Tsar abdicated in 1917. Had the U.S. come to the war too early, it would have bolstered the Tsar's position. Perhaps he wouldn't have stepped down. After the murderous Bolshevik regime took over, Wilson sent him $100 million in U.S. tax dollars. There's always been cooperation between communists and capitalists. Check out Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, or Joseph Finder's book, Red Carpet, which document this. David Rockefeller's private jet had landing rights in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. And the Rockefellers Chase Manhattan Bank had offices at in Moscow, 1 Karl Marx Square. We could talk about details like this almost forever. Another important motive for World War I was Zionism, but I'm going to leave that out of tonight's discussion, not because I'm copying out, because it's just too complicated and too complex for an introductory talk. You'll find an extensive chapter on Zionism in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Now let's bring it up to the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He got into office in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression, which the oligarchs generated, getting out of the stock market and then crashing the market in 1929. How did they do that? Well, number one, Federal Reserve almost doubled interest rates in 1929. Number two, they called in loans on investors who borrowed money to buy stock, forcing the investors to sell the stock. Number three, the oligarchs massively sold the market short, depressing stock prices, setting off a snowballing panic. When the smoke cleared, they moved back in and bought stocks at pennies on the dollar. Roosevelt's top campaign donor was Bernard Baruch. Two of the first things he did in office in 1933, he recognized the Soviet Union, even though between 1918 and 1926, the Bolsheviks had murdered more Christians than had been martyred in all the centuries before, going back to the Roman Empire. That's according to the lives of the saints of the Orthodox Church. Russia was, of course, an Orthodox Christian nation. The communists were the worst mass murderers in history. In 1931 to 32, Stalin murdered 7 million Ukrainians through mass starvation by having his commissars confiscate all foodstuffs. We call this the Holodomor. But despite unprecedented genocide, Roosevelt gave the Soviet Union diplomatic recognition. That wasn't all he did in 1933. Now, gold had been used as money up until 1933. You could pay for something with a $20 gold piece. Roosevelt demanded an end to this. Check out this. This is not a congressional act. It's an order of the president. Quote, under executive order of the president, all persons are required to deliver on or before May the 1st, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to a Federal Reserve Bank, branch or agency, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System. So American citizens were forced to turn their gold in exchange for pieces of paper. So where'd the gold go? Well, it was principally stored in Fort Knox. Now, just an anecdote. I used to go to a church with a lot of military guys in it, and one of them had been stationed in one of the units around Fort Knox, and he said it's commonly understood amongst the troops that there is no gold in Fort Knox anymore. It's not official, you understand, it's just understood. No one has been permitted to inspect Fort Knox since 1974. Ron Paul and other members of Congress have tried to inspect it, but no one is allowed inside, even if you are a member of Congress. And occasionally we've had news items like this, 66 billion in gold missing from Fort Knox, truckloads of bullion simply driven away. That article's from 1981. Now, I can't prove there's no gold in Fort Knox. The only way to prove it would be to go in there. But cumulatively, the evidence suggests that the gold, or most of it, was transferred to the oligarchs, and that's why President Roosevelt ordered all Americans to turn in their gold in the first place. By the way, gold was only worth $20 an ounce when Roosevelt gave this order. Once the gold was turned in, his administration raised the price of gold from $20 an ounce to $35. Now, of course, it's closer to $2,000. So if the oligarchs did confiscate America's gold, they made out like bandits, which is what they've always been anyway, as bandits. But Roosevelt's worst crime relates to Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, of course, Japanese warplanes launched from aircraft carriers attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, sinking or heavily damaging 18 warships, killing over 2,000 servicemen, and destroying nearly 200 planes on the ground. This was the event that brought us into World War II. I've been writing on Pearl Harbor since my first cover story on it for the New American Magazine in 1986. Russell Grenfell was a British historian and former captain in the Royal Navy. He wrote this in 1952. No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack on the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be put on the Japanese to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States. There's so many more quotes I could give you like this, but let's be concise. There are three basic things to know about Pearl Harbor. Number one, what was the fleet doing there in the first place, instead of its usual berth on the U.S. West Coast? The reason was that Roosevelt ordered it to be put there. Now, this is U.S. Fleet Commander Admiral J.O. Richardson. He was so outraged at Roosevelt's decision that he flew to Washington to meet with him and protested. There's a whole list of reasons not to put the fleet in Pearl Harbor. In the middle of the Pacific, Hawaii is susceptible to surprise attack from 360 degrees, but it could never be surprise attacked if it was kept on its normal berth on the U.S. West Coast. At Pearl Harbor, the fleet was boxed together like sardines, making them ideal targets for bombers. If a bomb missed one ship, it might hit the ship next to it. In addition to that, oil and other supplies had to be brought in over 2,000 miles of the Pacific. Also, 37% of Hawaii's population was ethnically Japanese. So if you're really worried about Japan, you're setting yourself up, setting the fleet up for espionage and sabotage. Also, moving 20,000 U.S. sailors to Hawaii away from their families would be bad for morale. The only reason Roosevelt could give to Richardson was that putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor would deter Japanese aggression. Well, guess what? As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew it didn't halt Japanese aggression. Yet, with the exception of John Toland, no mainstream historians have ever blamed Roosevelt for Pearl Harbor. They've always blamed the Navy, even though the Navy opposed the move. Admiral Richardson, by the way, was fired as fleet commander by Roosevelt after he made his objections. Number two, why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Well, there was a film shown to the public, Our Enemy, the Japanese, in which Joseph Grew of the Council on Foreign Relations told the people that the Japanese, quote, national dream is to see Tokyo established as the capital of the world. World conquest is their national obsession, end quote. But he presented no proof to support this claim. Was this little country with a land area smaller than Montana really planning to conquer the world? No, Roosevelt, this is the real reason for the attack. Roosevelt enacted an all-out trade embargo in conjunction with Britain and the Dutch. And this embargo was strangling Japan, which was dependent on imports for 75% of its food, 88% of its oil, and many natural resources such as rubber, tin, and iron. The official reason for the embargo was that Japan was an aggressor nation allegedly out to conquer the world. The evidence for this, it had moved its troops into China. What history books fail to mention is that the Japanese didn't set foot in China until the Soviet Union first conquered Outer Mongolia and the Chinese province of Xinjiang. Although no official state of war existed, the Japanese fought bloody battles with the Soviets. Dr. Anthony Kubik was chairman of the history department of the University of Dallas. Here's what he wrote in his book, How the Far East Was Lost. Quote, it was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and seriously threaten the security of Japan. But the Department of State seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in North China. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the Department of State to the Soviet Union, despite her absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time, Japan was censured for stationing troops in China. Here's the situation the Japanese were facing. They were across the sea from Russia and China. Russia was already communist, and the communists were boring their way into Mongolia and China. The Japanese knew if China became communist, they would then be isolated and next on the hit list. And their fears were well-founded because after we defeated Japan, China became communist in 1949. Well, Japan's envoys were earnestly negotiating for an end to these sanctions, and they offered to pull all overseas troops back into Japan from Southeast Asia, southern China. All they wanted was to keep a small foothold in northern China as a safeguard against communism. Now, in response to this, an ultimatum was given by our government to the Japanese. All troops must withdraw to Japan. Now, that ultimatum was authored by Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet agent inside the Roosevelt administration. This was confirmed in a press conference by Dwight Eisenhower's Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, in 1953. Now, to the Japanese, this ultimatum was a two-headed coin. You have a choice. You can either die by communism or die by economic strangulation. So the Japanese said, if you're only going to give us a choice to die, we're going to have to fight. And they took the bait Roosevelt gave them at Pearl Harbor. Number 3, Washington had foreknowledge of the attack. Now, before anyone says our government would never do that, should first familiarize themselves with the following resources. Pearl Harbor, the story of the Secret War, published in 1947 by George Morgenstern of the Chicago Tribune. The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, the Washington Contribution, published in 1954 by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor commanding destroyers on the day of the attack. Admiral Kimmel's story, written by Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet Commander. Infamy, published in 1982 by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Toland. I personally consider this the best book on Pearl Harbor. Watch the BBC documentary, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. You can watch it on YouTube. And the book, Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, published in 2000 by Robert Stennett. He used the Freedom of Information Act to uncover even more evidence. How did Washington know about the attack? Well, one way, we had cracked Japan's diplomatic code called the Purple Code. We had machines in Washington that were deciphering that code, often on a same-day basis. And copies of the messages, the intercepts, went to the president and a few key advisors in Washington. And what do these decoded intercepts reveal? Well, for one thing, that Tokyo had ordered its consulate in Hawaii to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 areas and on a frequent basis report the exact location of each American warship. Now, there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements, but when they're reporting the exact whereabouts of ships in dock, it has only one implication, which is the photography destruction. This was not passed on to our commanders in Hawaii. We even decoded Japan's declaration of war, the first 13 parts of that 14-part declaration the day before the attack. But this was not passed on to Pearl Harbor either until several hours after the attack took place. And thanks to Robert Stennett's revelations through the Freedom of Information Act, we now know we had also cracked Japan's naval codes, which included this intercept: Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese First Air Fleet, November 26, 1941. The task force, keeping its movements strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X Day, exact date to be given by later order. No one could not read that message and not understand its implications. Also, Washington was warned about the attack personally by the following individuals: Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan; J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, that is in the BBC documentary Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor, in which you will also see interviewed Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, who was the U.S. military observer in Java, which was then controlled by the Dutch. Now, the Dutch had learned of the Pearl Harbor attack. They warned Thorpe, who sent a total of 4 warnings about the Pearl Harbor attack to Washington until he was finally told, "Send us no more warnings about Pearl Harbor." Colonel F.G.L. Weigerman was the Dutch military attaché in Washington. He personally warned Chief of Staff General George Marshall about the attack. And Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies also received warnings about the attack, which they shared with President Roosevelt, who told them not to pass on this information in the interest of national security. None of these warnings were passed on to Pearl Harbor. But who was blamed for the attack? Our commanders in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter C. Short. Even though the Navy had protested FDR's plan to base the fleet in Pearl Harbor, even though Washington denied them all the intelligence they had received, Kimmel and Short scapegoated by a rigged commission, the Roberts Commission. Now, I'm going to have to leave it here, but there's so many more details, which you'll find with full documentation in my online post on Pearl Harbor, my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, and of course, the resource books that I previously listed. What are the goals of the oligarchs in World War II? Well, there's a lot of continuity from World War I. As usual, there was war profiteering. But second, and very important, was the establishment of the United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations, which had failed. UN was a bigger thrust towards world government. The plan for the UN was drawn up by a group of CFR members in the State Department, called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. They chose this innocuous-sounding name because they knew Congress had rejected the League, and they wanted to arouse no suspicions. When the UN held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the American delegates were members of the CFR. The Rockefellers funded the UN, that is John D. Rockefeller Jr. on the right, given a check for $8.5 million to buy the land for the UN to the first official UN Secretary General, Trygve Lie. Just look at that check for $8.5 million. It would be great to write out a check even today, in today's dollar values, for a check that amount. Now, the war also continued the expansion of communism. World War I had been used to establish the Soviet Union. World War II spread communism into Eastern Europe and China. Another agenda advanced by both world wars, again, was Zionism, ultimately about establishing the capital of world government in the city of Jerusalem. But again, it's too complex to address tonight, but you'll find it in my books and on my website. Let's move it up to the Korean War. Korean War began in 1950 when Kim Il-sung, the communist dictator of North Korea, ordered his troops to invade the South. But how did Kim Il-sung come to power in North Korea? You know, China didn't become communist until 1949, yet in 1945, Kim Il-sung was already communist dictator of North Korea. How is that? Well, it actually resulted from U.S. diplomacy in a roundabout way. In April 1944, Foreign Affairs, Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, published an article entitled Korea in the Post-War World, which suggested that after World War II, Korea, which had been a colony of Japan, should be divided into a trusteeship governed by the victorious Allies. Stalin and the Soviet Union were made trustees of the North and put Kim Il-sung in power. There's Stalin with Kim Il-sung. But what were the Soviets doing there? You know, they hadn't won the Pacific War. The United States had. Stalin had maintained a non-aggression pact with Japan during the war. Most people don't know that. But at the big three conferences of Tehran and Yalta, President Roosevelt asked Stalin if he'd break his treaty with Japan and enter the Pacific War. Stalin agreed, but only in one condition, that the United States supply him with all the weapons, vehicles, and materiel his Far Eastern Army would need for the expedition. Roosevelt agreed, and at U.S. taxpayer expense, some 600 shiploads of supplies were sent to Russia to equip Stalin's army to fight Japan. But Stalin was very clever. He waits until the war is virtually over. 5 days before the war officially ended, after the atomic bomb had already pounded Hiroshima, and Japan was suing for surrender, he sent his troops into China to fight the Japanese. As a reward for this 5 days participation in the Pacific War, Stalin was made the trustee of North Korea. Stalin established a communist government under Kim Il-sung, built a 150,000-man army equipped with hundreds of tanks, hundreds of warplanes, and heavy artillery. But when the United States left South Korea in 1949, we didn't leave them one warplane, one cannon, or one tank, not even one anti-tank gun. This was an absolute recipe for war. The people at the top already knew what was coming. Now, why did the oligarchs, what were the real reasons they orchestrated the Korean War? There were two major purposes. One was to permanently strip Congress of its constitutional authority to declare war. Did you know that when President Truman sent troops to Korea, he didn't even bother to consult Congress or speak to congressmen? He claimed he didn't need to because his actions were justified by UN mandate. We were now under UN authority. At his press conference of July 29th, 1950, Truman said, quote, "We are not at war," and affirmed that this intervention in Korea was simply a, quote, police action. Over 30,000 U.S. soldiers were killed in Korea, over 100,000 wounded in Korea. Now, folks, that's a war. But not to worry, according to Truman, just a little old police action. We have not had a declaration of war since World War II. The second purpose, well, remember we said at the start they wanted a world government? The second motive was to empower the UN as the international peacekeeper. Even though 90% of the Allied troops in Korea were Americans, 15 other countries did send small token forces. Now, in the lead article for the April 1952 Foreign Affairs, was called Korea in Perspective, the author summed up as follows, quote, "The burden of my argument then, based on the meaning of our experience in Korea as I see it, is that we've made historic progress toward the establishment of a viable system of collective security, that is to say, global security." Now, eventually, the oligarchs realized they weren't going to get world government simply by empowering the UN. Too many countries resisted it. So in 1974, a new strategy was laid out by Richard N. Gardner in Foreign Affairs. Here's what he wrote, quote, The House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than the top down. An end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. End quote. In other words, they're going to create world government piece by piece through regional blocks like the EU, trade treaties like NAFTA, the World Health Organization, environmental treaties like the Kyoto Protocol, etc., etc. So much more that can be said about the Korean War. I have a full chapter in my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, and it's also a free article on my website. Let's bring it up to the Vietnam War. Now, the trigger point for escalating that war was the Tonkin Gulf incident, in which Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly fired on U.S. destroyers on August the 4th, 1964. And that led to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was not a declaration of war, but President Lyndon Baines Johnson did get authorization from Congress to escalate the conflict however he saw fit, which he massively did. But what really happened in Tonkin Gulf on August the 4th, 1964? Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, was a pilot stationed in the Tonkin Gulf at that time. He was later shot down, spent 7 years in a communist POW camp. After returning home, he summarized his experiences in his book, In Love and War, which I have a copy of right here. Stockdale was called to the scene of the alleged Tonkin Gulf attack, but saw no Vietnamese boats during 1.5 hours of overflight. The key quotes about him from Tonkin Gulf are in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. But here are his concluding quote describing his reaction to President Lyndon Johnson's decision to escalate the war based upon the non-existent attack. Quote, I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. How do I get in touch with the president? He's going off half-cocked. We're about to launch a war under false pretenses. I felt it was a bad portent that we seemed to be under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy vain enough to pick their own legitimacies regardless of the evidence, end quote. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. The decision to escalate the war was actually not Johnson's idea. He did not want to escalate the war, but was persuaded to do so by a group of 14 secret advisors. 12 of them were members of the Council of Foreign Relations. They were called the Wise Men. That was their nickname. And they're described in the book, The Wise Men, by Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas, who themselves were members of the CFR. Their leader, who was in charge of demanding escalation from Johnson, was former Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Make no mistake about it, Acheson had been pro-communist all his life. Even before the United States recognized the USSR in 1933, the murderous dictator Joseph Stalin selected a young attorney, Dean Acheson, in the United States to represent Soviet interests in America. While Secretary of State under Truman, his State Department was chiefly responsible for the fall of China to communism, which is why the House of Representatives passed a unanimous resolution calling for him to resign. One of his law partners was Donald Hiss, member of the Communist Party, and the brother of Alger Hiss, notorious communist spy. And did you know that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written before the Tonkin Gulf Resolution incident even took place? So who wrote it? It was Acheson's son-in-law, William P. Bundy, Council on Foreign Relations, Skull and Bones. Back in the 1950s, Bundy had been the head of defense for the head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund. Then after he left the State Department, David Rockefeller appointed him editor of Foreign Affairs. What was the Vietnam War about? Well, ostensibly the war was to spread the halt of communism, and that's certainly who our troops were bitterly engaged with, communist forces. But despite the public remarks about the domino effect, for the oligarchy, the war was not about fighting communism. Here's a photo from the summer of 1945, and here we see members smiling of the OSS, which became the CIA, with the communist leader Ho Chi Minh and his top general, General Giap. The OSS armed and trained Ho Chi Minh's men, gave them tens of thousands of cartridges, not to defeat the Japanese. The Japanese were already on the brink of defeat. It was to drive out the French. That had been President Roosevelt's official policy, to make the French leave to leave Southeast Asia after the war, which left a vacuum for the communists to fill. Later on, Ho and General Giap would oversee the killing of 58,000 American GIs. Thank you, CIA. If we had time, we would discuss how after the French left, the U.S. forced the Emperor of Vietnam, Bao Dai, the one man who could unify Vietnam, to step down in favor of quote-unquote democracy. Now the CIA, under the auspices of Edward Lansdale, who you see on the right, disarmed the local indigenous anti-communist groups, removed the CIA from the equation. The U.S. would never have fought the Vietnam War. Now, I'm not saying there aren't good people in the CIA, but you usually don't find them at the top. You can read about what I just said about Vietnam in Hilaire de Berry's book, Background to Betrayal, The Tragedy of Vietnam. What was the Vietnam War about? Like most wars, it was multifaceted, but tonight I'd like to focus on one facet. A lot of the war is about changing the culture of America. In 1963, we were still a Leave It to Beaver culture. But by 1969, just 6 years later, we'd been transformed into a Woodstock culture. In the Strawberry Statement, Notes of a College Revolutionary, student radical James Coonan described the 1968 annual meeting of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which spearheaded the war protest movement. Here's what he wrote, quote, also at the convention, men from Business International roundtables, meetings sponsored by Business International, tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's leading industrialists, and they convene to decide how our lives are going to go. They are the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We also offered Esso Rockefeller money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotions so they can look more in the center as they move to the left. End quote. Now, back in 1970, me personally, I was a hippie. I used to hawk a radical Boston newspaper called The Phoenix, which evolved into a more radical left-wing newspaper called The Real Paper. Do you know who the publisher was of The Real Paper? It was David Rockefeller Jr. His name was right on the masthead. Now, this guy here is Vito Polikas, considered one of the prime founders of the hippie movement. In fact, some people say he was the original hippie. He brought topless go-go dancers to the Sunset Strip, and Wikipedia even credits him with coining the phrase freak out, like freak out, man. Well, ironically, Vito's uncle was the father-in-law of Winthrop Rockefeller, David Rockefeller's brother. The Rockefellers were very close to the hippie left-wing movement. Now, some of you will remember Timothy Leary, the king of LSD, right? So let's watch this clip.
Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves.
Now, the counterculture, which started as an anti-war movement, evolved into the feminist movement. And by the way, if you go on YouTube, you can see Gloria Steinem, founder of Ms. Magazine, talking about her years with the CIA. But it also evolved into the gay movement, the abortion movement, and today of course, the transgender movement. So much more to be said about Vietnam. Check my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which has a full chapter on the war and why it was dragged out for as long as it was. We're almost up to break time. But before we go there, I'd just like to mention the year 1979. I like to say that 1979 was the year the whole world turned on a pivot. In 1979, we recognized Red China, beginning the transition of China from a backwards communist country to a technocratic communist country, which is what it is today. Jimmy Carter unilaterally broke relations with Taiwan and recognized Red China, even though the U.S. Senate had voted unanimously that he should consult them. He refused to do that. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, marking the beginning of the Soviet collapse. 1979, the CIA started supporting the Mujahideen, which would include Osama bin Laden. 1979, pushed by Jimmy Carter, the Shah fell, making Iran into a radical theocratic Islamic state. I believe personally that you can trace the Arab Spring to this. I know Iranians are not Arabs, but this marked the beginning of Middle Eastern countries being taken over by radicalized Islam. I have an article on the New American website. It's called Iran and the Shah, What Really Happened. After we published that article in 2009, we received a thank you from the former Empress of Iran, the wife of the Shah. Farah, who requested 8 hard copies of that article. I know that the United States initially supported the Shah, but in 1975, Henry Kissinger decided that he had to go. 1979, also pushed by Jimmy Carter, President Somoza fell from power in Nicaragua. Now you put together the fall of Iran and the fall of Nicaragua, you've got Iran-Contra. 1979, we gave away the Panama Canal. And something else happened in 1979 that struck me as really weird at the time. You know, during the entire Vietnam War, more than a decade, no major film was made that portrayed U.S. soldiers in Vietnam positively, with one exception. And that was John Wayne's The Green Berets. Now, he faced a lot of opposition in Hollywood. And the only reason that movie got made was because John Wayne was determined to make it. And he still had enough clout that he was able to get it done. Now, Hollywood made countless movies about World War II that portrayed U.S. soldiers positively, even all during the Vietnam War, The Dirty Dozen, The Great Escape, The Battle of the Bulge, Patton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you couldn't do that for Vietnam. When The Green Berets was finally released, it was savaged by the critics, and some of you will recall it was met with protests and demonstrations. But then comes 1979, and the Oscar for the best movie of the year goes to The Deer Hunter, a movie that portrayed Vietnam soldiers positively. I did like a double take on this, you know, and this is followed by more movies that showed Vietnam soldiers as heroic. And I said, what happened? Hollywood forbid movies about Vietnam soldiers that showed them as heroes, and now they're the good guys, and you even give them the Best Picture Oscar. So what happened? Well, what happened was something else that occurred in 1979, which was an international conference on terrorism was held that year in Israel under the auspices of Benjamin Netanyahu and his father. Many dignitaries from around the world attended, including George H.W. Bush, former CIA director and future president. See, the deep state already knew that the Cold War was going to end, and they decided to rehabilitate the image of the modern U.S. soldier, because they had already envisioned a new mission for our military, the war on terror. Now, we're actually well more than halfway through this presentation, but we're going to take a little break here and then resume. Before the break, we were discussing how events of 1979 marked a turning point in globalist strategy. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, introduced glasnost and perestroika, and the Soviet Union liberalized. I realize that some authors, such as Anatoly Golitsyn, said that this was fake, but in any event, the Cold War against Soviet communism did effectively come to an end. Now, what should have happened is that with the Soviet threat gone, our military budget should have been reduced, but instead, the Cold War was simply replaced by the war on terror, and Soviet communism was replaced by Islamic extremism, or in cases, alleged Islamic extremism. And Hollywood prepped us for that with movies like Black Sunday, where the Palestinians are trying to blow up the Super Bowl, or rescued by an agent of the Israeli Mossad, which is the CIA. And Chuck Norris and Delta Force, where they rescues hostages taken by the Palestinians and take them to safety in Israel. Then, of course, 1985, the same year that Gorbachev came to power, Hollywood released Back to the Future, which portrayed Libyans as rabid, fanatical terrorists with their eyes popping out of their head, you know. Great Scott, Marty, it's the Libyans. All right, so the very next year, a bomb blew up at Lovell Discotheque in Germany, which is frequented by U.S. servicemen. 2 servicemen were killed and dozens wounded. And so President Reagan bombed Tripoli. American intelligence had picked up intercepts of Libya indicating Libya was behind the incident. What Americans didn't know, we were punked. The Mossad, which again is Israel's CIA, planted a transmitter called a Trojan in Tripoli, which was broadcasting messages that made it appear that Libya was behind the incident. What's my source on that? My source is The Other Side of Deception by Victor Ostrovsky, former officer in the Mossad. And I have a copy of his book right here. Now, in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, you'll find the relevant quotes about the Trojan. According to Ostrovsky, tricking Reagan into bombing Libya was considered by the Mossad as one of its greatest successes. Let's take it up to the Gulf War of 1991, and to summarize that, I'm going to turn to a journalist named Barry Zwicker, because he summarizes it so well.
Fast forward again to August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
All right. Now, even Wikipedia now admits that the baby incubator story was a complete fraud. I'm just going to add one thing. This was not a congressional hearing that she was testifying at. They brought in some congressmen to make it look that way. It was entirely staged, filmed not in Congress, but at the offices of the PR firm of Hill & Knowlton. Now, let's take it up to 9/11. Was 9/11 everything the government said it was? 4 things that people should know about 9/11. Of course, there's more than 4. These are 4 basic ones. One is the anomalous collapse of the Twin Towers. The government said the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapsed solely due to plane impacts. I want to show you part of a video interviewing physicists on this. This short excerpt of it.
Pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
Assuming that the top section on the left contains enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the tower, and assuming we dropped both upper sections at the same time, which one would hit the ground first? It would be the second, of course. As it finds no obstacles in its path, the section on the right would quickly accelerate to free fall speed and maintain it all the way to the ground. The section on the left instead needs to use some of its energy to destroy the structure below, so it could never achieve free fall speed. In the case of the Twin Towers, however, both upper sections fell with an acceleration close to free fall speed, as if their path had been practically free from obstacles. It took each tower between 10 and 12 seconds to collapse to the ground, while an absolute free fall time would have been 9.2 seconds.
Something I want to add to that. As you can imagine, when the World Trade Center was constructed to provide support for this very tall building, the steel at the bottom was thicker and stronger than the steel at the top. It went progressively lighter as you went up. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense that the light steel is going to cut through the heavier steel as it comes down. Something else I want to show you about this. This is North Tower collapsing. If you watch the towers collapse, there's no heavy pile driver crushing the floors below it, exploding floor by floor. There's no big 40-story chunk coming down on top of what's below it. Now there's something else I wanted to show you about the Twin Towers. Just freeze it right there. See those black things that are off to the side there? Those long black things? Those have been identified by scientists as steel girders, and many of them were thrown up to 2 football fields in length at speeds of up to 70 miles an hour. A number embedded themselves into neighboring buildings. Here is a piece that embedded itself in the American Express building. This is a collapse. They simply should have come straight down. Also, number 2, the collapse of Building 7. Building 7, also called the Salomon Brothers Building, was part of the World Trade Center. It's where the CIA and the Secret Service had their New York City headquarters, as well as the Security and Exchange Commission, which are all the records of investigations like the Enron scandal. Now, let's watch on the afternoon 9/11, Building 7 falling at 5 p.m. .6 seconds for 47 stories to come down. I'll stop that there. The government argued that Twin Towers collapsed because of airplanes, jet fuel melting or softening the steel. That argument can't apply to Building 7 because it was never hit by an airplane. And yet it fell at free fall speed. You know, if you drop a ball, the farther it falls, the faster it goes, and that's true of Building 7. That's been measured. As it falls, it increases in speed, meaning nothing was holding it up. And yet it had 81 upright steel columns. The government tried to argue that office fires caused Building 7 to collapse, but office fires only existed on 6 of the 47 stories, and office fires have never caused a steel frame structure building to fall down. Some have argued that debris from the Twin Towers might have damaged the building, but the damage would have been to the front of the building facing the Twin Towers, not the back or the sides or the center. So if anything, it should have teetered and fallen forward, not fallen down straight with. Asymmetrical damage doesn't cause symmetrical collapse. And in 2017, a study by engineers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks determined that fires could not have caused the building to collapse.
Question.
And I want to show you an important interview with Richard Patterson, captain of the New York City Fire Department.
Having responded from home, my attempt was to locate the command post.
Interview with Richard Gage.
Chief Fox was then battalion chief in that area of Manhattan. And it took some time for us each to recognize who the other was, because we're both completely coated in the toxic dust cloud, to which he said this time, I got a 40-story building behind me going to beat the band and nobody around to put it out with. At which point, we then walked towards 7 World Trade, which was in fact the building of which he was speaking, which indeed had a number of fires on various floors. Fires in numerous locations are suspicious. I have the authority to make that call. None of what we were looking at in 7 was beyond our scope to extinguish. So he and I made our way over to the entrance of the building. Before we arrived there, there was a construction worker who happened to be, he emerged from the dust cloud and walked past the chief and I. And he said, he had overheard the chief's comment, and he paused and said, that'll be coming down around 5 o'clock. We part ways, we arrived at 7, and there were 2 paramilitarily clad men with black rifles, And as we approached the entrance, they closed ranks and said, one of them said, "This building has been secured." Which is odd, because in my experience in the FDNY, anybody preventing access to the fire department in the event of a fire, that's a criminal act. The chief and I were not in a position to argue the point, given the inequality in weaponry present.
All right, so just to summarize, they wanted to put the fire out, they had the ability to put the fire out, they were prevented from putting the fire out, and they were told it would come down at 5 o'clock exactly as it did. And I'm sorry.
Yes. Question, do they have a theory of why the Twin Towers came down then? If it wasn't...
Oh, there are 3 theories, but I didn't want to, I'm trying to stick with known facts as opposed to speculation.
There's no facts at this point?
Yeah, I do have a theory of my own, but I didn't want to get into that tonight. I'd rather just stick very close.
But there are no facts that you know of?
Oh, there are facts, but different people with different theory will point to facts that support the theory, just like an attorney in the courtroom. So, yeah, I won't go into that element. But in any event, this is Jane Stanley of the BBC. At 4:40, 20 minutes before Building 7 collapsed, she announced that it collapsed. And viewers could clearly see Building 7 still clearly in the background behind it. That's where the red arrow is. So BBC London said, "We seem to have lost Jane Stanley." And they cut her feed. This is Lucky Larry Silverstein. He acquired the World Trade Center, technically a 99-year lease, just 6 weeks before 9/11, making a down payment of $124 million, most of which was borrowed. He just put up $14 million of his own money. But after 9/11, he was awarded an insurance payout of $4.6 billion. How'd you like to make $4.5 billion in 6 weeks? No wonder the guy's smiling. Now, normally Silverstein would have breakfast every weekday morning in the North Tower in the restaurant called Windows of the World. But there was one morning he didn't show up. You know what morning that was? September the 11th. He said he had a fortuitous doctor's appointment. Also, his son Roger and daughter Lisa also worked in the World Trade Center, but they didn't show up for work that morning either. If I was a district attorney, I would have been looking into this. And number 3, the remarkable speed and accuracy of the plane hits. I'm sorry to remind you of this. It'll only take a few seconds. Right. Now, according to the FAA, how fast was that plane going? It's going at 586 miles per hour. So Wikipedia. Now this is Dan Gavados, who at the time was chief pilot for Meridian Airlines. He would qualify pilots. You might recall that the day after 9/11, all flights were grounded, so pilots had nothing to do. So Gavados said to his pilots, "Hey guys, let's see if we can hit the Twin Towers on a simulator." Now a simulator is a multi-million-dollar machine. It's the closest thing there is to real flight. It wasn't a 767 simulator. It was which hit the Twin Towers, for a Boeing 727, which is much smaller and more easy to maneuver. All of these pilots had thousands of hours of experience flying Boeings. Not one of them could hit the Twin Towers. They all missed. And bear in mind, they couldn't get the simulator up to 586 because it would freeze up around 450, because you're not supposed to take a Boeing at ground level or around 500 because it threatens the structure of the plane. So the question is, if Boeing pilots couldn't hit the Twin Towers at 450, how did Marwan al-Shehi, the alleged hijacker of Flight 175, who'd never flown a Boeing in his life, never even a simulator, how did he do it at 586? Same thing from Muhammad Atta. Hit the North Tower dead center at 465, even though he was a psychotic drug addict with no Boeing or simulator experience either. And then the Pentagon was hit by this guy, Hani Hanjour. Now, Hani Hanjour was a very bad pilot. He tried to rent a little twin-engine Cessna from Freeway Airport in Maryland the month before 9/11. The flight instructors at Freeway took him up in a Cessna, and he had such trouble controlling it at 75 miles an hour, they refused to rent it to him. So if this guy could control a little Cessna at 75, how was he able to climb into a Boeing cockpit for the first time in his life, make a perfect strike on the first floor of the Pentagon at 535 miles an hour, according to the FAA? When you think about it, the Pentagon is a big building, but it's not a tall building.
And it would have made sense for him to hit it like a dive bomber, but instead, he chose the most difficult possible approach, coming in from the side. This wasn't like the Olympics where you get extra points for degree of difficulty. This is Captain Russ Wittenberg, former U.S. Air Force pilot with over 100 combat missions. He's a retired commercial pilot. He flew for Pan Am and United for almost 35 years. And here's what he said. I flew the 2 actual aircraft which were involved in 9/11. Flight number 175 and Flight 93, the 757 that allegedly went down in Shanksville. Flight 175 is the aircraft that's alleged to hit the South Tower. I don't believe it's possible for a terrorist to train on a Cessna 172, then jump into the cockpit of a 757, 767 class cockpit, and vertical navigate the aircraft, lateral navigate the aircraft, fly the airplane at speeds exceeding its design limits speed by well over 100 knots, make high speed, high bank turns, pulling probably 5, 6, 7 Gs. I couldn't do it, and I'm absolutely positive they couldn't do it. Number 4, Dick Cheney's failure to deploy the Air Force. Now here's a video that probably most of you haven't seen. It's an interview with Nelson Garabito of the Secret Service.
At 9:05 a.m., American Airlines learned Flight 77 from Dulles to Los Angeles was hijacked. It was already turning around, this time heading for Washington, D.C. Nelson Garabito, footnote 208, was the Secret Service agent in charge of protecting the White House airspace. In Washington, Vice President Dick Cheney was hustled to a nearby bunker, while the president was on Air Force One.
First thing I did is I picked up the phone to call my contact, the FAA. He said we have 4 planes outstanding. 2 have hit the towers, and 2 are headed to Washington, D.C. One of them approximately 30 minutes out, one of them approximately 45 minutes out.
All right, let me stop it there. He's saying a lot of contradictory things here. He says that there were 4 hijacked planes outstanding, 2 headed for the Twin Towers. Nobody knew the Twin Towers had been targeted until they were hit. And also, it would be impossible to have 4 hijacked players on radar at once because the last plane wasn't even hijacked until a half hour after the second tower had been hit. He also says that he was given this information from his contact at the FAA, whose name was Terry Van Steenbergen. Van Steenbergen was interviewed by the 9/11 Commission, and he said, I didn't give that information to Nelson Garabito. He told me. At the FAA, we don't have radar that can see that far out, but the military does. Now, even though there's a lot of contradiction here, the important thing is that both Van Steenbergen and Garabito confirmed that Washington knew that 2 planes were headed in that were hijacked, one 30 minutes out, one 45 minutes out. And it was confirmed to Van Steenbergen by Garabito that Vice President Dick Cheney, who was in command at that time, knew about it. Now, the question is, why did Dick Cheney fail to deploy fighters to intercept? It was always standard procedure. Whenever a plane went out of control, went off course, he lost contact with the cockpit, to contact to the NORAD and the Air Force. Andrews Air Force Base is only 11 miles from the Pentagon. Its own website stated it was, quote, in the highest state of combat readiness. Major Daniel Kane, supervisor of flying at Andrews, phoned the Secret Service and asked if they needed help. The answer he got was no, not at this time. We'll let you know if we do. So Dick Cheney sat there for 30 minutes, and he waited until the Pentagon explosion occurred. Then he gives the order. Now Andrews is ordered to deploy, but he's only got 15 minutes left now. And as it turns out, those fighters weren't needed because Flight 93, the last of the planes, crashed in Pennsylvania due to a passenger revolt, the famous Les Roll, at least according to the official story. Dick Cheney's failure to deploy any fighters when Flight 77 was still 30 minutes out is something that should have been investigated. Now, I'm sure I haven't convinced people in this short amount of time that this American deep state had something to do with 9/11, but if they were, what would be their purposes be? Well, one would be that they wanted to pass the Patriot Act, which reduced civil liberties and gave the government unprecedented authority to spy on its own citizens. Remember, we said at the beginning, the oligarchs are the enemies of freedom. And they've been trying to get the Patriot Act passed every year before 9/11, and they couldn't. It took 9/11 to enact that legislation. The other thing is war. Let's hear from General Wesley Clark, whose positions included 3-star general. His positions included Supreme Commander of NATO.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
All right. So actually, if you read Pat Buchanan, who I quote in Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Paul Wolfowitz and other figures in the Bush Defense Department were already planning these wars before 9/11. Now in 2019, I was working on a major book about 9/11. I had hundreds of pages of notes and rough drafts of 16 chapters, and then COVID hit. And so let's hit COVID-19. I could see this as a global operation. It was the highest priority new agenda of the deep state. So opposing it became the highest priority. I dropped the 9/11 book and worked day and night to produce this book, COVID-19 and the Agendas to Come. Red Pill, 27 chapter book. After 5 days, it was number 266 of all books on Amazon. Actually, it rated higher than that. And for 2 months, it was the #1 bestseller in lung and respiratory diseases. They didn't have a COVID disease category, at least at that time. It traded the #1 spot with Judy Mikovits's book. Then after 2 months, Amazon censored it, and they wouldn't tell me why. They wouldn't give me a reason. And I was a registered nurse, in Massachusetts for 45 years, retired in 2019, just before COVID struck. I knew Amazon didn't have any medical people who could identify anything wrong with the book. And the book has almost 300 endnotes. I have links to peer-reviewed journals, virologists, epidemiologists, Nobel Prize winners. If there was a mistake in the book, I would have been happy to correct it, but they wouldn't tell me why the book was censored. The last thing they told me was, we reserve the right to remove any content that provides a poor customer experience and remove that content from sale. Well, 92% of Amazon's customers gave it 5 stars, 8% gave it 4 stars, not a single customer gave it 1, 2, or 3 stars. So anyway, I took the book to a book distributor, and as soon as he saw the sales numbers from Amazon, he snapped it up, and they got it in Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, other bookstores, including overseas. So the book kept selling. It was only Amazon that censored it. But the reason I wrote this book was, one thing about COVID that alarmed me as a registered nurse was I knew that healthy people who have no symptoms, you don't have to make them wear masks and stand 6 feet apart from each other. Everybody in the country was suddenly supposed to do that. And, Dr. Fauci has admitted in private emails secured to the Freedom of Information Act that masks don't work. A virus, I know there's controversy about what viruses really are, but a virus is so small you need an electron microscope to see it. So it's going to pass right through the breathing holes in your mask. Trying to keep out a virus with a mask is like trying to keep out mosquitoes with a chain link fence. Also, Robert Redfield, the director of the CDC, former director of the CDC, has now admitted that the 6-foot distancing rule was totally arbitrary. There were no scientific studies that supported it at all. And yet there were small business owners that committed suicide, basically only let 1 or 2 customers into the stores at the time their businesses failed. Now,
it was clear to us who had been watching the oligarchs for decades that the COVID lockdowns were not about health, they're about control. It was the latest maneuver to take away civil liberties, closing churches, closing small businesses, restricting travel. It was also designed to force people to take mRNA vaccines, which skipped over animal trials, were rushed to the public without adequate safety testing. Many people were told they'd lose their job unless they took the vaccine. The deaths and disabilities from COVID vaccines are massive, but are attributed by the media to coincidence or even climate change. Now, my book was published in 2020 before the vaccine rollout, but if you go to my website, jamesperloff.net, you'll find updates there with innumerable cases of young individuals who have died or become highly disabled after taking the vaccine. Here are some stats from the CDC itself from March of this year, 2023. These are adverse reactions to COVID vaccines. This is called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And here we see listed 35,000 deaths, 196,000 hospitalizations, 148,000 urgent care visits, almost 250,000 doctor's office visits, over 10,000 cases of anaphylaxis, which would be a allergic reaction, almost 17,000 cases of Bell's palsy. And this doesn't go into even some of the other more common reactions like myocarditis. Bear in mind, a study by Harvard a few years ago showed that only about 1% of vaccine reactions even get reported to VAERS. Many doctors and nurses don't know the system exists. And I can show you instances where hospitals have fired their employees for reporting to VAERS because hospitals were making good money off of COVID. Now, VAERS, last time I checked, only had about 50 employees, and they were totally backlogged. So the true numbers would be much, much higher than the graphic you see here. And some of you who follow this know people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Nobel Prize winner Luc Montagnier, Dolores Cahill, one of the world's leading immunologists, full professor at Dublin University, Dr. Peter McCullough, one of the most eminent cardiologists in the world, Dr. Michael Yaden, former chief science officer at Pfizer, and many other prominent scientists have denounced the lockdowns as fraudulent and the COVID vaccines as anything but safe and effective. But these people, with a possible recent exception of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., never get interviews on mainstream media. Instead, they would interview Bill Gates, who's not a doctor, not a scientist, but he's worth over $100 billion, and his foundation gives millions of dollars to the TV networks. Gates, of course, is obsessed with reducing world population. He's a eugenicist. He openly boasts that his father was a director of Planned Parenthood, the largest provider of abortions in America. In a 2010 TED Talk on overpopulation, he said, quote, "The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. And Gates said, quote, "Now, if we do a really great job with new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Now, some people said he was being taken out of context. To the contrary, go back to 1968. In its annual report, the Rockefeller Foundation addressed the problem of what it called problems of population, and it lamented, in this circled paragraph here, that, quote, "very little work is in progress on immunological methods such as vaccines to reduce fertility, and much more research is required if a solution is to be found here." Now, here's a 1989 article from Dr. Fauci's own NIH, National Institute of Health, on the development of anti-fertility vaccines. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's right on the NIH website. In 2010, the World Health Organization, backed by a $10 billion grant from the Gates Foundation, began giving women in Kenya tetanus shots, 3 tetanus shots, whereas normally you get 1 shot every 10 years. It is only being given to women of childbearing age. So doctors in Kenya got suspicious, and they sent the vaccines to independent laboratories for analysis. And the labs found that the vaccines contained a sterility chemical, a substance that blocks HCG. That's the hormone that allows women to ovulate or produce eggs. This is the very thing that the Rockefeller Foundation and the NIH were talking about in their previous reports. One of the things claimed during the pandemic was that we should go cashless because money might transmit COVID. Now, coupled to this was the idea that we need a digital ID. As a note of interest, the Bible speaks of the Antichrist and how no one could buy or sell without his mark. Now, during COVID, in many locales, you couldn't buy or sell without a mask. Then the mRNA vaccines came. In some places mandated you couldn't buy or sell without proof of vaccination. Michelle Wu, the mayor of Boston, did this. You couldn't go to a restaurant or some of the other major public venues without proof of vaccination. That's no longer required in Boston, but may come back depending on what happens. And you might say, well, that's not a mark. Well, hold on. Now, check this out. This is not a conspiracy theory. From the website of the Rice School of Bioengineering. Ignore the fact that the language gets technical. Quote, Kevin McHugh, an assistant professor of bioengineering at Rice since this summer, and a team at his previous institution, MIT, report in a cover story in Science Translational Medicine on the development of quantum dot tags that fluoresce with information after they're injected as part of a vaccination. The tags are incorporated in only some of the array of sugar-based microneedles on a patch. When the needles dissolve in about 2 minutes, they deliver the vaccine and leave a pattern of tags just under the skin, where they become something like a barcode tattoo. Instead of ink, this highly specific medical record consists of copper-based quantum dots embedded in biocompatible micron-scale capsules. Their near-infrared dye is invisible, but the pattern they set can be read and interpreted by a customized smartphone. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came to us and said, hey, we have a real problem knowing who's vaccinated, said McHugh, end quote. Again, that's Rice School of Bioengineering. In addition to that, a company in Sweden called Disruptive Subdermals has developed an implantable microchip that gives a PDF of your vaccine record. And this is now being combined with people's financial records. The Bible says a mark will be on your forehead or on your hand. Here's a woman making a purchase at Whole Foods using a microchip embedded in her hand.
I'm at Whole Foods and I'm about to pay for my groceries with my That's the coolest thing ever.
Now, she says that's the coolest thing ever, but what happens if the government remotely shuts off your chip? So digital ID, that is not a conspiracy theory. Now, in communist China, they're totally cashless. Even the beggars don't take cash. You swipe their card or QR code to donate. And in China, they have what is called a social credit system. If you do anything the government doesn't like, points are taken away from your social credit score, and suddenly you find you can't get on a train or a bus, you can't get a job or even buy something. And by the way, speaking of the Antichrist, the book of Revelation says he'll rule the world for 3.5 years. To govern the world would require a world government. That's something to maybe bear in mind when we look at the globalist drive for world government. Now, finally, climate change. I have a very extensive post published this year, Eat the Bugs, but we're just going to hit some highlights here. For nearly 3 years, the primary agenda of the oligarchs was COVID. Then last summer, 2022, there was a sudden switch and climate change became number one. And we started getting bombarded with headlines like this. I'm not saying there won't be another pandemic which might take center stage, but right now, climate has become number one for the globalists. Of course, climate change has been around for a while. It evolved out of the term global warming. I'm going to play you a clip here that I think you might enjoy.
Clear, Mr. Kennedy's not a scientist. I am. He's the CEO of the Weather Channel now. I was the founder of the Weather Channel, not the co-founder.
And I'm glad you did, because I am addicted to the Weather Channel. I watch a lot of cable news.
Now, hold on just a minute. I'm not done. And CNN has taken a very strong position on global warming that it is a consensus. Well, there is no consensus in science. Science isn't a vote. Science is about facts. And if you get down to the hard, cold facts, there's no question about it. Climate change is not happening. There is no significant man-made global warming now. There hasn't been any in the past, and there's no reason to expect any in the future. There's a whole lot of baloney, and yes, it has become a big political point of the Democratic Party and part of their platform, and I regret it's become political instead of scientific, but the science is on my side.
I don't think we're going to come to a conclusion about the topic right here. What I do wonder,
I know
though, is
we're
when
not,
you
because
see
you wouldn't allow it to happen on CNN. But I'm happy that I got on the air and got a chance to talk to your viewers. Hello, everybody. There is no global warming.
What I do wonder is when you see the government, when you see NASA, when you see other institutions say that 97% of climate scientists agree, do you think they're making it up? What I don't understand is how you square that.
That's a manipulated figure, and let me explain it to you. The government puts out about $2.5 billion directly for climate research every year. It only gives that money to scientists who will produce scientific results that support the global warming hypothesis of the Democrat Party position. So they don't have any choice. If you're going to get the money, you got to support their position. Therefore, 97% of the scientific reports published support global warming. Why? Because those are the ones the government pays for, and that's where the money is. It's real simple, but that doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't make it true. That only makes it bought and paid for. The money goes in circles.
I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to try to refute you on
that's
the facts.
The truth.
I'll simply say that the
please
vast
stand
majority...
back from this issue and let the two sides be on the air.
Don't you just love it when somebody kicks CNN's butt like that? Okay. Here's a cartoon that sums up the point that Coleman was making about finances. But, you know, back in the 1970s, all the predictions were for global cooling. Check out these time covers. The Big Freeze, How to Survive the Coming Ice Age. A lot of you will remember Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek. He had a series that he hosted called In Search Of. In 1978, they had an episode of called The Coming Ice Age. Let's play a brief clip from that.
In the past million years, it has advanced and retreated with clockwork regularity. If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history. What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought. During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
In 1977, the worst winter in a century.
We'll stop that there. Now, then what happens? It starts to warm up. And look at times covers now. The heat is on. Global warming. Be worried. Be very worried. So what's going on here? Here's a graph of global temperatures. Turns out that temperatures tend to run in 60-year cycles, 30 years up and 30 years down. It's only by a small number of degrees on average, but enough to feel some impact. And here we see there was a tremendous heat wave in 1878 with dozens of deaths and countless hospitalizations. There's an article on that, The Great Heat Wave in the West, August 1878. Ontario, Canada hit 103 degrees during that heat wave. But the temperatures leveled off and dropped for 30 years. And in 1913, something called the, you see it on the graphic here, the White Hurricane was a snow hurricane that hit the Great Lakes, sinking 12 ships. But then temperatures started rising again, and you get the Okie Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and temperatures rose and leveled off in the 1940s and started going back down. I remember my senior year in high school in 1969, we had so many snow days, they couldn't even make them up. And in 1978, we had the biggest blizzard in New England history. And that was the year that Nimoy made that video. And the Great Lakes got hit again. Some older folks might remember Gordon Lightfoot's song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. That was a real ship that went down from a cold hurricane in Lake Superior in 1976. What happens, as you would expect, temperatures started to rise again, but this time Al Gore, mouthpiece for the oligarchs, labels it as global warming and says it's all being caused by selfish people using too much energy.
And the experts started making the usual wrong predictions. Check this out. UN predicts disaster of global warming not checked. 1989, senior U.S. environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. Now temperatures leveled off, as you would expect, and that's why they changed the terminology from global warming to climate change. It's always been blizzard, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts. The difference is now every one of these events, the media automatically labels them climate change. Actually, do we have climate change? Check out this graph from the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. There has been no increase in climate disasters over the last 22 years. This graph goes from 2000 to 2022. Not that the oligarchs and the military don't have some means of actually faking weather, controlling weather. You can engineer a storm or even create a fire. If you look at the fires in Santa Rosa in Paradise, California in 2017 and 2018, we could add Maui to this. They burned the houses to the ground, even melted the granite tabletops, but they did not affect the trees around them. Now these were called forest fires, but forest fires are supposed to burn forest. Now they're making war on carbon dioxide. Well, carbon dioxide is very vital for plant growth. It's a naturally occurring substance. Plants need it for photosynthesis. It's good. It's not a toxin. Greenhouses pump in carbon dioxide to increase plant growth, but now it's being treated as though it was a toxin. Carbon dioxide, by the way, it's only 0.038% of the air. Most of the air we breathe is oxygen and nitrogen, and carbon dioxide is 1.5 times heavier than oxygen and nitrogen. So the idea that it's going to rise up through the atmosphere and lock in heat is ridiculous. You'll find all the documentation for that in my blog post. But they want to reduce your carbon footprint, and that's why California, New York, and Massachusetts and the EU plan to ban the sale of new gas-driven cars by 2035. By the way, this is absurd. Not only do these electric cars cost much more than gas-driven cars, where do you think the charging stations get their power from? It's not from solar panels, it's from coal and other fossil fuels. So you're not reducing your use of fossil fuels at all by charging a car, you're just adding an extra step. What's really about is restricting your travel. The county of Oxfordshire in England has been divided up into 6 districts, and you can't drive outside your district unless you get permission from the government. Otherwise, your car might give off too much carbon. This is being piloted in Vienna also and other EU cities. You see how this is locking us down? COVID locked us down, now climate change is locking us down. By the way, do you think the oligarchs apply these restrictions to themselves? Al Gore made a movie called An Inconvenient Truth, and he said, stop using dryers, hang out your clothes on clotheslines. Stop using so much AC in the summer, stop using so much heat in the winter. But guess what? The Tennessee Center for Policy Research found that Gore's mansion in Nashville, Tennessee used 20 times the national average of electricity. Even had an indoor heated pool room. And how about Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he became governor of California, he said fighting climate change was top priority. And he signed legislation penalizing Californians for their electricity use. But guess what? Schwarzenegger didn't want to live in the capital, Sacramento. He wanted to stay in his mansion in Los Angeles, and he flew to work every day in his private Gulfstream jet. It's 3 hours of flying time. According to the LA Times, that jet gave off more carbon in 1 hour than a car would in a year. Bill Gates has gone from the greatest expert on pandemics, now he's the world's greatest expert on climate change. But he flies around in a private jet that uses 486 gallons of fuel per hour. Some say it has the biggest carbon footprint on the planet. When the WF members meet in Davos, Switzerland, they come in their private jets as many as 1,700 at a time. And they want you to move into tiny little box-sized homes. They say it'll even make you less racist if you do that. But while they're living in luxurious mansions, they want you to live in these little homes. Bill Gates lives in a 66,000 square foot mansion with an indoor movie theater. They also want to destroy crops because they say that pigs and cattle and goats and chicken are burping and farting too much, and that's causing global warming. And they actually want to destroy the livestock. Bill Gates says we must shift to artificial meat. And of course, he's heavily invested in that. Bill Gates, by the way, is now the largest farmland owner in America. Last check, he's got over 250,000 acres. I wouldn't look for anything natural or organic to come out of that. Here's a quick video from the World Economic Forum about eating bugs and worms instead of meat. go, World Economic Forum. All right, how about CNN? Drink up cockroach milk as a protein drink you didn't know you've been missing. They've got the actress Nicole Kidman doing an ad where she eats crickets and worms, and Kim Kardashian is doing ads for Beyond Meat. I'm not playing these videos because of time constraints, but you can click and play them on my website article on climate change. It's not just meat they're after, it's crops. The Netherlands is Europe's largest food exporter. The government plans to close 3,000 farms, claiming the fertilizer they use is bad for the environment. This resulted in a massive protest by farmers, which are totally ignored by our media. Here we go, Germany, same thing. Germans banned from using nitrate fertilizers and shift towards green farming. They're setting us up for famine. No meat, no crops. CNN also wants to give up your dogs and cats. They say they have a bad carbon paw print. And look at this. Kids are cute, but they're not really eco-friendly. Science proves kids are bad for Earth. Miller Outlicky suggests we should stop having them. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum now says as humanity moves further towards a post-carbon future, people must accept that things like eating meat and property ownership is simply unsustainable, says Klaus Schwab. I'm almost done. Played 3 really short videos that say so much.
We need to eat less meat. We need to stop land being used for cattle and growing grain for the billions of animals that we keep in our intensive farms. And then finally, we cannot hide away from human population growth, because it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
All right. So that really sums up the climate change agenda: make war on livestock, make war on grains, and reduce world population. By the way, the population 500 years ago was 500 million. If you're familiar with the landmark depopulation Georgia Guidestones, they say that world population should be 500 million. And Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, has said we need to reduce world population by 95%. How are you going to do that other than killing people? Or maybe if they're thinking long term, they're thinking of sterilizing the world against its will. But I don't know any of the ways you can do that. This next video is just 20 seconds long, but it's kind of significant.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
Okay, so grab that. They want to actually track what you eat and where you go, like contact tracing with COVID. Right? Final video. I consider this one important because it ties together tonight's whole presentation.
We are back discussing over the future of the world and over the best solutions for the world. That's the first good news. Decarbonization of the economy is the biggest challenge that we have to face, which will help us to reconciliate growth and climate. We should be aware that over the last 3 years, we have entered a new era of globalization. We have shifted from a market-driven globalization to a politically power-driven globalization. China cannot be out. China must be in. Let's be very clear. The key question is not China first, or United States first, or Europe first. The key question for all of us and for all the nations in the world is climate first.
Let me stop it there. Okay, that's the last video tonight. You got that? Climate change is now the driving force behind globalization. No country can be number one. Climate is number one, so to fight climate change, all the countries of the world have to unite. What's that? It's world government. It's the same thing we're pushing more than 100 years ago with the League of Nations. The World Health Organization is doing the same thing with its global pandemic treaty, which would give it the right to override national constitutions and dictate policies for each country in response to the next pandemic. You see, all of this is about world government. And just as they're using They used 9/11 to push for the Patriot Act, reduce your freedoms. COVID, lockdowns, reduce your freedom. And now climate change lockdowns are reducing your freedom. These guys don't support anything unless it reduces your freedom, if you're looking to tie all this together. What hope do we have? I always remember something a combat officer from the Vietnam War said in an interview. He was asked this: it seems like the establishment is so powerful. Any point in fighting against them? He said this based on combat experience. He says, look, when you're surrounded and outnumbered and the situation looks hopeless, it's true that if you keep on fighting, you may lose. But if you give up fighting, you're guaranteed to lose. So keep on fighting. And there's one other very important thing. We have the truth on our side. These guys don't. All right? And because we have the truth on our side, God, the creator of the universe, is a God of truth. God is on our side. And the scriptures guarantee us that God will prevail and that his people will prevail, even if they suffer temporary misfortune. I'm sorry to have kind of overshot our time here. Before I turn it over to Matthew, let me just mention briefly my books at my table. Shadows of Power, the History of the Council on Foreign Relations, Tornado and Junkyard as a source scientific debunking of the theory of evolution, which turned many people into atheists, including myself in my youth. Selection of the Conservative Book Club, The Case Against Darwin is a highly abbreviated version of that book. Truth is a Lonely Warrior, an extensive primer on the New World Order. Sometimes people ask me, when are you going to update the Shadows of Power? I say, I already did. Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's just that it's not focused exclusively on the Council on Foreign Relations because it's much bigger than the Council. Look at the World Economic Forum. Something like vaccines don't fall under their purview at all. 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw is a companion book to Truth is a Lonely Warrior, expanded on times I just briefly covered in that first book and added things that book missed, like the effects of wireless radiation, the atomic bombings of Japan, etc. I've already mentioned my book on COVID, and the most recent book published last November is A Spiritual One, Missing Saints, Missing Miracles, because I realize increasingly it's evident that the solution to our problems is grounded more in spiritual solutions than in geopolitical ones. That book, by the way, is written from an Eastern Orthodox perspective and has some interesting info about Christian history and miracles that is largely missing in the West. I hope this talk, I know it has been long. I've tried to make it as comprehensive as possible without giving you too much detail. I hope it's been helpful for understanding what's going on in our world. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perloff, for coming out and seeing us. I hope you guys enjoyed it. For me, it's an honor to be among the guys that have that much information in their head at the same time. So what I'd like you to do is enjoy. We have to get out of here by 9:45. So there's some food left over. Ed, make sure you eat the rest of the salami.
All right.
And we are going to ask that you guys come up here and talk to Mr. Perloff if you have some questions briefly. We are going to start packing up slowly, but we'd like to have a chance. And I'll be sitting with him over here to. You can buy some of his books from him as well.
Oh, we really have till 9:45?
We have till 9:45.
Oh, I thought he got you in big trouble by talking till 9.
Well, he starts giving me the warning about 9 o'clock. So don't want you guys to feel too rushed to come out here. We have Constitution is the Solution class that's starting on the 8th. Again, I'm going to mention that again. Very important to understand what it means to be an Americanist versus a Republican or a Democrat. Which is what is destroying our country. And if you read George Washington's farewell address, you'd understand that. The other thing we do is we have Sean McBride coming up here talking about what are the dangers of K-12 public education. So he's going to talk to you about the work that he's been doing in Maine. I hope that you guys come out and see him. We are working with a group down in Massachusetts called the, oh gosh, now I can't remember the name of it. They're called the, okay, they're a good group though, let me just tell you. So I want you to get involved with the John Birch Society. You can sign up today. You're going to learn about how to fight America. We've been working on this. We've been holding back the globalists for a very long time. They used to call it Agenda 2021, and now it's called Agenda 2030. We've been pushing back at them for a very long time. I did bring a copy of Agenda 2030 back there for $8, so you should read about it, learn about how they are systematically redesigning your government locally from the ground up like a virus, okay? That's what they're doing. That's what you need to figure out, how you can get involved and how you can stop it. Anyway, thank you very much for coming out.